The question, where are you from, has always been an awkward one for me growing up. I sort of touched on this last year when we did childhood. My roots have been cut and repotted numerously. My father was from Scotland, my mother from Spain, and they moved all over the world. I now live in self-imposed exile in Swiss mountains, and given how often I pass into France or Italy on any given weekend, as we live right next to the border, it should make me something of a standard bearer for some brand of European identity. Yet I don't feel particularly European, or indeed particularly Swiss, or British, or Spanish. But that doesn't mean I don't have local allegiances, places that feel like home. So what I'm going to suggest over the next 10 minutes or so is that identity is both extremely important in driving much of our behavior, but also largely an illusion. That it has much to do, I'm going to argue, with love and loneliness and the making of a home. But also that when it predicates behavior, it can be entirely destructive. So let me return briefly to the notion of European identity, since so much of our bandwidth is being taken up with this. Things like Brexit in the UK, might be the Lega Nord in Italy or AfD in Germany. Almost every European country has some version of identitarian movement. And by that, I'm meaning a movement that places local traditions, cultural homogeneity, and national or geographic identity above, say, things like multiculturalism, liberalism, and globalism. Of course, that is somewhat crude as a distinction, but that's the way I'm framing it. The making of communities that identify over ideology or religion or landscape appears to be not only extremely desirable to human beings, but often shapes much of human behavior, even if those identifying conditions are abstract, invented, and sometimes, I suggest, a foil for some other motivation. Now, I respect the European project as the making of an identity where tribal factions are replaced by a broader, more inclusive sense of I. And the slow cultural homogenization that comes out of something like a European project has, I think, much in its favor. Clearly, there's a very strong argument for the EU, and that is the prevention of war in Europe, with the principle that a shared identity will stop us coming to blows. Rightly or wrongly, because I think history might suggest we simply displace the enemy next door with a common external enemy. It does, however, seem to recommend the view that we will go to extraordinary lengths to protect and preserve an idea of identity, however flimsy the notion may be. What strange creatures we are. What on earth do we do this for? I don't know. We'll give our lives for a flag or a symbol or a phrase. And what extraordinary lengths of cruelty humans have gone to in response to people's allegiances to particular identities. I think we can turn, I would argue we can turn to almost any time in history, and probably any part of the world right now, to see that sort of cruelty and that sort of state control over things happening. And, an example might be in China and the treatment of Muslims with the sort of re-education programs that are going on. And effectively, to me, that seems to be a good example of allegiance to an identity package that is not the state, to something else, to maybe a higher belief, to some other set of identity problems, and a state that's not in any way prepared to accept that and wants to sort of re-educate it and reform it into an acceptable version. I leave that open. I'm not an expert on this, but I think it's an interesting one to consider. The invented sense of belonging that is European perhaps won't forge until all Europeans fight side by side against another continent, right? It's been suggested. Or until we've all spoken the same language for a very long time, or worshipped similar gods, perhaps Google or Amazon. Or just that the syncretic process is far too young to assess. I think syncretism is fascinating. It's arguably why the Roman Empire grew so successfully. It's that amalgamation of local cults and traditions into a broader identity. It allowed local cults, specific things we can look at even with the Christian tradition. We can see things like trees and Yule logs being sort of brought into the tradition, that are not part of the tradition. But it seems to be a way of suggesting that it's easier than just fighting over every detail. So for the march and the progress of that broader identity to continue, it's easier, the syncretic process, to allow those smaller things and just let certain things slide, so long as things like taxes are paid. I think that was the sort of thing the Romans were particularly keen on. The point here is that there's a long tradition of individual identity being held within broader cultural or religious identities. And the more successful identity movements, for want of a better term, have, I think, been paradoxically both more tolerant and syncretic in detail, but also generally forced upon people. When Aristotle begins the Ethics by saying man is a social animal, he's prefacing, well, in my opinion, he's prefacing individual moral action with the idea of belonging to a bigger set. So it's a sort of you within the set, within the set, within the bigger set, the social set, the social animal set. And other than living as a hermit, it seems we just can't avoid belonging in some sense. As an aside note, and obviously there's no time to talk about this right now, but I think it's very interesting is the sort of opposite to that, the opposite paradigm to that is an interesting cultural position, and that's the often being the sort of micro-state for artists and for writers, which is that place where you don't belong. You don't quite belong with the status quo. And I think there's been, historically, there's been a sort of place for that. In Shakespeare has it with the fool and the court jester. So Touchstone is that sort of character who lives on the back of the status quo, at the same time pointing out all the faults of it and criticizing it all the time, yet also profiting from it at the same time. And I find that an interesting thing to talk about. Jan Kott says, I think beautifully, the fool knows that only true madness is to recognize that the world is rational. Now, whilst the European movement has, if anything, been fabricated to put away swords, and I think I would agree with that, and bring us together under one banner, it has opened up not only questions about European identity or national identity, but in many ways a kind of identity crisis. Referendums, as we're all aware, I'm particularly aware of this because I live in Switzerland and we have referendums every Sunday. But that's part of the problem is I'm not used to it, but Swiss people are used to that. They do everything on referendum. Britain has not quite the custom of it yet. They force binary decision-making upon people, and that means voting to some extent on your sense of belonging. I don't find it surprising that a city like London may feel broadly European, or that there are people in Cornwall or Newcastle that may not. But that's obviously too simplistic. An analysis of the votes on things like ethnicity and wealth show far more complex lines of division. Complexity is something I think media and politicians hate. It sort of dilutes arguments and brands. They like it to keep nice and simple. I remember reading an interesting article by Rakib Ehsan in the LSC on the Asian Leave vote, and I quote from it here, so I thought it was particularly interesting. He said, he asked the questions, why did some South Asians vote for a campaign that was at times seen as bigoted and xenophobic? Why did a number of middle-class South Asians, most notably those living in West London, not vote in a way which their socioeconomic status would predict? Well, one reason he suggests might be that many voters within the British South Asian diaspora don't feel European. When the Remain campaign sought to appeal to a sense of European identity and warned that people were about to lose that identity, it didn't make for a particularly convincing argument. So my point, I'm not going to really get into that, my point, which may be fairly redundant, is that much of politics we're living in is not so much about the evaluation of trade or economic possibilities or geopolitical strategy, but simply a reflection of the identity packages that we subscribe to, where we feel at home. If we felt European, we now perhaps feel extremely angry and upset that we're leaving Europe. If we never felt European in the first place, nothing perhaps has changed. Perhaps some people might even feel that there's the possibility for a strengthening of old allegiances and older ties that had been fading. Interestingly, though, it's the vitriol from both sides. The vitriol shows how this identity, how strong it is and how potent it is in people's lives, to the point that people reduce so much of their lives to a position, even if it means breaking their friendships or behaving shamefully. And we see plenty of shameful behavior. This reduction of one's moral and existential drivers to an ideological position or community, I find deeply unsettling. Indeed, I find it hard to align myself with anything unless there are 1,000 caveats. And again, I suspect we look to the group because we are social animals. But that in itself begs a question, I think, that what are we as we make this big to the larger community? So it's a question not of group identity, but of personal identity. And there begins a whole conversation about things like essence and existence. Some of you might subscribe to the idea that we are something, that we need that to find ourselves, that we, so to speak, we look for that thing. Our life is a process of discovery. Others, myself included, might prefer the French existentialist position that existence precedes essence, i.e. we become what we do, become as we live. But we can probably agree that perhaps more identity possibilities exist than ever before. And so Jacob touched upon this 29 possibilities. Less and less are people defined by geography. They can define their tribe online. And there are tribes now of gamers and activists, where once perhaps we didn't know anybody outside our valley. But that valley that we escape through the online forum, for example, is of course not just a human valley, but it's a home for other creatures, wild creatures. Unlike our wild creatures, we don't seem to be content to just do things. We need, as I believe Nietzsche said, the why, and with that we can cope with almost any how. Wild things cope or don't with the how, and that's it. That's why we don't see depressed songbirds or suicidal deer. We see deer that starve and we see crows that eat them. We, it seems, are somewhat different. We look up at the night sky and we ask, why? And I suspect all our identities connect ultimately to this fundamental questioning. That questioning is, I think, a statement of loneliness. Belonging is an attempt to relive this existential burden. And religion has historically, I think, been the most successful at this, though perhaps Netflix will prove to be the ultimate salve for existential angst in the coming future. So my sense is that every little act in the service of ideology, religion or club or whatever, however true and beautiful those things are, so I don't want to detract from the beauty and the truthfulness of those things in themselves, is an affirmation of belonging. And it's a response to loneliness, or as Buddhists would have it, suffering. The tribe prevents loneliness. It tells us there are others, there is strength in numbers, and there is purpose. It is, I believe, being alone that predates all our questions and ultimately all our ideologies. And I don't hear me being physically alone, but existentially, in the sense that we can imagine the cessation of our lives. We can conceive of the world after we have died. I find that quite tremendous, that we can conceive of the world after we've died. And that opens up a treasure trove of other unsettling questions. Indeed, our greatest achievement as a species is arguably developing the conception of our own mortality. And so I'm led to a conclusion that identifying is a lost attempt at solving the question of loneliness. Group identification is, I think, perhaps displacement activity, like those sad animals we see in zoos, walking backwards and forwards. And like most of us, I've spent so much of my life engaged in this displacement activity, attempting to belong to various places and things, and never have I found any ultimate sense of consolation. It's always been a sort of Pyrrhic victory. Every successful entry and acceptance into a world or club or place leaves one with a deep sense of discontent, that there was nothing much there to belong to in the first place, that it was predominantly an illusion. But don't mistake me, I don't want to cast off the spells that enchant us. I'm not arguing for a purely rational appraisal of all our identity packages or a destruction of them. An esoteric and anecdotal argument that the I is not fixed but can be somewhat larger, which is really the point I'm pushing towards. The I is larger, more fluid, is that I think, and I think probably lots of you here would have had these experiences, that I've had numerous experiences that attest to that sense that the I is much broader or capable of being much broader than we ordinarily allow it to be. If you go for long runs, as my friend Michael will know, your mind can wander away from your body and begin to associate with things around you, identify with things around you, and displace away from your actual sense of where you are in the present. You can start to associate with trees or sky or other people. Meditation does the same thing. Sitting still can allow the settling of the mind and an expansiveness, an awareness that you're only partially an observer, but paradoxically you're a part of what you observe. You're, in a sense, indivisible. And recently I had this wonderful experience in Thailand. We just came back from diving, where we, weightless, drifted through a school of batfish, and somewhat indescribably found myself both inside and outside of myself, looking upon these creatures that came right up to our eyes, and sort of looked back upon me as though we were both at once perplexed, yet familiar to each other. I think we can be more complex. We can be open to more, less inclined to the obvious or the inherited. I think it's a bit like that thing you do as a child when you stare at a river, and I'm sure you've all done this when you were kids, and you look at the river and you become aware that it's there, but it's not there, because the bit of water you focus on goes out of sight in seconds, and it's replaced by an entirely different body of water. Yet it's still a river. So you know it's the river, but it's not the river because that piece of water's gone, and there's a new bit, and there's always a new bit, and it's constantly replacing itself. It's there but not there. And I think of ourselves in this way, here but not here, somewhat caught between past and future. The 11-year-old child that we once were, the promises we've broken, the ideologies that we've abandoned or adopted, the shared body that we've punished with vegetables, things like that. I remember taking a course in romantic poetry many years ago, and my professor telling a perplexed group of young lefties, of which I was included, that Coleridge and Wordsworth flirted with the left, and we were all quite happy with that, and that they flirted with revolution. And he concluded by telling us that they all ended up as conservatives. It was immensely disappointing for everyone. We thought, how is that possible? And then he shrugged and said something about, and it's really stayed with me. He said, everyone eventually realizes that conserving what you love is more important. And that's always sort of played on my mind, that, you know, imagining some of these people, Wordsworth and people, walking through the Lake District and being overwhelmed by a sense of the things that they love and the conservation of that. And that's, as an aside note, an interesting thing. To what extent has the idea of conserving or conserve been largely forgotten in the dialogue between, say, the left and the right? People talk about conservatives and what is conservatism, and you know, that sense of to conserve something. And I find that really, really interesting. Not that I'm particularly subscribing to this one side or another. My failing as a student was to make a casual link between socialism and everything that I valued or loved without the analysis to see that it was absurdly simplistic. Indeed, that love of people, places, and things exists on all sides, and I think that's something in my 29 plus years I've learned. So why did we choose this topic this year? Well, there's a whole piece of theatre being enacted before our eyes, as we all know. There's Trump and Brexit and Europe, migration, project of globalism. And there's our planet, our home, the only place we belong, the ecosystem, potentially collapsing. And I'm not just talking about things like global warming, but the less advertised catastrophes, like the decrease in insect numbers, which just I find harrowing, that 2.5% annual decrease in insect numbers. That's no insects in my child's life. And whatever consequences that brings. And we're not talking about biodiversity just, we're talking about biomass. The sheer annihilation of another species, I think, ought to be more than sotto voce sort of collateral damage as we talk about these bigger problems like Brexit, for God's sake. In the midst of all this, the dominant voices are the demagogues. And that seems to be all the bandwidth is taken up with. However, I'm not sure we can blame them entirely. We live in democracies, and yet our democratic voices can be entirely hysterical. Complex arguments being reduced to 280 character slogans. And I read somewhere that 33 characters is the average for a Twitter post. Just rather short, I think. Plato's famous argument for the large and powerful animal was precisely a critique of democracy, that it doesn't work, that government will only ever placate the mob, be that through lower taxes or less migrants or more jobs. I always also optimistically felt that the critique only really stood in the absence of education. That a demos of critically thoughtful people could elect good government and so forth. And by and large, I think that's true. By and large, I think and I'm speaking broadly here because of course there are huge exceptions, but broadly speaking, the cultures that we inhabit are incredible places of diversity and respect, with laws and rules that protect the weak and the vulnerable and curb the possibilities of the ruthless and the tyrannical. We have parks, we have museums, we have theatres, we have symposiums in Sweden, and we've created complex language to share ideas. So whilst we watch this theatre of demagoguery play out, I think we ought to remember that all is not lost by a long shot, though dung beetles will disagree with that statement. We are, by and large, nations of reasonable and kind people, with private fears, losses, and loves, and a shared desire to belong, to make a home, and to make a sense of our place in the world and our time here. So I want to conclude with two things, an assertion and an appeal. My assertion, this is sort of the philosophical bit, and then you can make what you will of the appeal. My assertion is that our sense of identity, personal or group, is largely an illusion, born from the existential questions that define us as human. At best, I think there are infinite creative possibilities of selfhood, because mind is, I believe, boundless. At worst, I think identity is voluntary enslavement. My appeal is that we refute simplistic rhetoric. We embrace complexity, and we engage in thoughtful reflection and discussion with selves that are permeable, curious, creative, and guided by a boundless mind. Thank you.